So a few months ago, actually now it's about 9 months ago, I got a book in the mail. It was a moleskin notebook, an empty book that was sent to me indirectly from the Moleskin company so that I could participate in National Handwriting Day, which is held on January 23rd every year to celebrate handwriting. I think it was a scam produced by the stationery companies of America, but all sorts of people like Katie Couric had agreed to do this, and Malia. So I said I would do it. They sent me the book, and they sent me a pen, a very odd little flat pen. And they said all you have to do is draw something in the book and take a picture of it, send it to us. We'll put it on Facebook, and you can put it on your social media if you want. But this will help people to understand how important handwriting is in this day of highly automated forms of communication. So I wrote this. I made this little picture of a hand, and I wrote something like, "I don't know what to think until I write it down," which I thought was very clever. And I took a picture, sent it in to them, and they said, "This is great. Could you do a little hashtag National Handwriting Day at the bottom, hashtag Moleskin?" And I figured I'd already taken a little bite of the shit sandwich, so I wrote that down and I sent it in, and they said, "That was great." And I looked on the Facebook a few days ago and I never saw it there. So I kind of sold out. Well, I got the book and I got the pen. I lost some of my integrity, but I had this notebook. Every day for the last 4 years, I've been entering the events of the day with drawings into one notebook after another. And so I sort of consume a lot of notebooks. And I was very happy to have this new notebook to write in, even though I had to sort of write around this sort of self-indicting page where I had sort of, pimped for the Moleskin book. The Moleskin, in case you don't know, moleskin has nothing to do with moleskin. It's a heavy cotton fabric, and it's sort of identified with sort of the geniuses of the 19th and 20th century. Like Hemingway was supposed to have one, and I think Oscar Wilde had one, and Picasso and Van Gogh had one. It became famous when Bruce Chatwin, the famous diarist, was writing song lines, and he went into his favorite New York, Paris stationery, and they said, there's all in French, they said, "There are no more moleskins." And he wrote that down, and then some smart person said, "Well, we'll make moleskins, and everybody can pretend that they're Hemingway or Van Gogh or Picasso." They're very nice books, but they're very clever people. After about 6 months, I guess it was about 6 weeks into writing in this book, I discovered that I hadn't actually been given a blank book at all. I've written around it, but up in this corner you can see somebody has written 4 lines and a date. It's November 24th. It's in Italian, and I sort of tried to translate it on my own, but I was not getting anywhere, so I had a couple of friends take a crack at it. First, Louisa, who's not here, and Paul. Is Paul here? There's Paul. Louisa's translation, which is very close to Paul's, and Paul, I may need to call on you for a slight intervention. She wrote, "I have a need to go to the wine bar this evening. Tomorrow I have a lesson. Afterwards, I have to order sashimi plate for the party Thursday. I hate turkey and haven't been able to tell him for 10 years. Which is very intriguing. If you do a little research into the history of Moleskins, has their American headquarters in Chelsea, just a few blocks from the publisher who had sent me this thing. So I imagine some disgruntled employee some woman perhaps who was, had moved here from Milan and was having to go to Thanksgiving with her idiot American boyfriend for 10 years, and hated turkey, would prefer something sophisticated like sushi or sashimi. And I was hoping I could sort of build the story around this. This is like the perfect random piece of information, a kind of message in a bottle. I sent it to Paul. Paul said, this is not by an Italian. This is terrible Italian. This is somebody practicing Italian. And they're making all sorts of hilarious mistakes. The only crucial difference in the translation, though, is that you said, I hate turkey, but haven't been able to say it for 10 years. Now, is there a gender pronoun situation here? Is there an it and him problem? If you say, is it clear if somebody says, I haven't been able to tell him, as opposed to I haven't been able to say it?
Yeah, she would have had to use the indirect object pronoun to say that I would have been able to tell him.
So does that mean that they really don't know Italian at all, or they just don't know how to say I hate Italian, turkey in Italian? Mm-hmm.
And there are a few other things in the text that are indicative of somebody studying Italian and having a good idea what they're doing, but not being fully aware of the situation.
Okay. I decided it probably didn't matter whether this was an Italian expat pining away or some upwardly striving American. Because in a sense, they were still revealing part of their soul. Whatever they were doing, whether it was a practice or, the real mystery that remains is why anybody wrote this one paragraph in the middle of a blank book and then put it back on a shelf, and then had somebody else discover it, and how it ended up with me, I don't know. But in any event, there is a sort of a discomfort with a tradition and an attempt to sort of replace the tradition of one tradition with another. As it turns out, almost everybody seems to hate turkey. When I looked into it, there's pages and pages devoted to the reasons why turkey is a terrible food to try to eat and cook. One chef even said, having turkey for Thanksgiving is like inviting an evil midget to your house and having him defecate on the dining room table, which is powerful. Of course, Turkey has a much more delightful history in America. We're probably all aware of the anecdotes about Benjamin Franklin, who in a letter to his daughter was comparing the turkey much more favorably to the bald eagle, which had been selected as a national emblem. He said he felt like the eagle was a thief who merely, and a scavenger who sat on the sidelines while smaller, harder-working birds did the work of hunting and fishing, and then it would swoop down and take the food away, whereas the turkey, which was admittedly a sort of vain and silly bird, was also very territorial and brave and would defend itself against all comers. He would have preferred the snake as our national symbol, the rattlesnake, for similar reasons, but we ended up with the bald eagle. It turns out it's not just Italians or wannabe Italians who would prefer fish to turkey on holidays. You might have seen this piece recently about the growing preference for sushi amongst Orthodox Jews. Sushi is interesting because as fish and often rice, it sort of falls in that safe zone between meat and dairy. It can be used in a lot of different food situations. As long as the fish itself is kosher. To be kosher, the fish has to have fins and scales, which eliminates delicious sushis like eel. But one of the more controversial sushi items is imitation crab. Imitation crab, as you probably know, is not crab at all. That's why it's called imitation crab. It's made out of pollock, which is a cod-like fish that has many, many fins and many, many scales. But the word crab, even with imitation crab, is so disturbing to the observant that in order to promote the sale of imitation crab, it's called kani, which is the Japanese name. It got me thinking about the sort of power, not only of the sort of the laws, the dietary laws and rituals that we follow, but the language around it. That reminded me of a trip I had taken when I was a young man, a rafting trip on the Green River in Utah with my brother and a bunch of young Mormons. We went down the river with bucket loads of beer, and they went down the river with bucket loads of Coca-Cola. And remember at the end of the day once, we were sitting around the river, and we had drunk all our beer, and they had drunk all their Coca-Cola for the day, and they were still thirsty. So I took a beer can, and I filled it with water, and I handed it to, let's call her Katie. And she took this can of beer, and she wanted to drink it, and she wanted to be a good sport, and she sniffed it, and she looked down on it, and then she put it down. And we never discussed what was going on, but I don't know what was going on. Was it the smell of beer? Was it the possibility that there was a minute amount of alcohol in the can? Or was it the sign on the can? I think it had to be the sign. The whole thing was loaded with too much symbolic power, too much of a transgression for her to even think of putting it to her lips. Although maybe also she was afraid that other people would see her drinking and they would think she was drinking beer. But it didn't have a terrible effect on the rest of the trip, but it always struck me as a very big, strange problem. The Mormons don't drink hot drinks either, but nobody really knows what hot drinks are. It's been interpreted to mean no coffee or tea, and the assumption is that the caffeine in those is something that is wrong, except we've already seen that they drink lots and lots of Coke. That's a little controversial. Somebody had to actually issue an order recently that Coke was okay. When you ask somebody in the church about it, they say, well, the reason we don't drink Coke, these hot drinks, is we don't want to limit our choices, that consuming this beverage interferes with our ability to think clearly somehow, which I guess you would have to drink a lot of coffee to do, but actually that's not true. Coffee's always, since its very beginning, had a sort of problem balancing its appeal with its strangely transgressive qualities. Jews have a problem with coffee once a year at Passover. At least they did, because there are certain dietary laws that kick in for Passover, not other times. You're not, as you may recall, you have to when you're getting out of Egypt fast, you can't have any, the bread doesn't have time to rise, you have no leavened bread. But that seems to mean that there are all sorts of things that could cause leavening are also off limits for Passover, including beans, all kinds of beans, legumes, which meant you couldn't drink coffee because coffee comes from coffee beans, apparently, but not in reality. As it turns out, a very clever ad man hired a rabbi in about 1920 to look into this problem. And he concluded that coffee beans are not beans at all, they're fruit, which is true. The bean is covered by a fruit surface, and we call it a bean, but it's basically just the seed. It's a seed from the plant. And that made it possible for Jews to drink coffee, a delicious beverage, on Passover, which increased coffee sales. Now this came home to roost. We, as you may know, live in a synagogue, and when we moved into the synagogue, certain things had to be done. A synagogue is just a building, except for the places where the Word of God touches us. So the Ark, where the Torah is, the Torah had to be given away, and all the wood around the Torah was thrown out and buried because it touched the Torah. It was buried as a person. And then all the prayer books were thrown away. They had been thrown up in the attic, and then they had been taken away and thrown out, which meant that we were unable to find any copies of a very famous book, the Maxwell House Haggadah. Some people obviously have seen this. Some people have not. It sort of depends. In my family, we use the same Haggadah over and over again every year, which is the book you follow while you may know that you drink 4 cups of wine and you eat matzah with this sort of mash of apples and honey, and so especially when you're 8 years old, you drop a lot of it into the book. So every year, the book becomes thicker and crustier. But that was sort of the appeal of the Maxwell House Haggadah, is that you get a new book every year. What had happened is the Maxwell people, who were based in Nashville. They had nothing to do with Jews at all, but they were sort of very forward-looking. They had a very extensive ad campaign. They hired a Jewish ad company who said, well, look, we can really increase sales around the holidays. We'll get the rabbi to say that the thing's a fruit, and then we'll make this book, because actually a lot of companies were making Haggadahs of various kinds at the time. But theirs caught on. It's been going around for years now. Something like 50 million copies of that book are put out every year. I thought online I found the sort of most brilliant, the oddest manifestation of the Maxwell House Haggadah, which was once they had convinced, the rabbi had convinced the rest of the Judaism that the coffee was made from fruit, then why wasn't coffee the fruit of the wine as well as fruit of the vine as well as wine? And so in this Haggadah, you drank 4 cups of coffee. And it advised you to switch to decaf after the second cup. And I thought, this is great. This is too good to be true, and it was too good to be true. It was an artist website. But they'd done a beautiful job with this kind of 50s-looking guy drinking coffee, and don't be fooled. You have to be. But this problem of wine and coffee persists, and actually goes back to the origins of coffee itself. It was discovered in Ethiopia about 1,000 years ago. It's been around. Coffee, the flower and fruit system is a familiar survival mechanism for any plant. It's attractive and desirable, and some creature will come, whether it's a bumblebee or a cat, and it eat this fruit and then move it away and drop the seed someplace else and spread the seed. I think in addition to that, whatever the flavor profile of the coffee bean fruit is, the caffeine in it has an effect on creatures that consume it. So one of the first stories about how coffee came to be a civilized beverage was that somebody saw birds eating seeds and then becoming extremely agitated and decided to try it themselves. More interesting specific legends involve a mystic named Omar, who was famous for his ability to heal by the laying on of hands. And he made a few enemies with the laying on of hands and was exiled to a cave outside of town. I think it was in Medina, and he was starving to death. And there was the only thing around was this bush with red fruit, so he tried one of the things, and it was very bitter. So he put it in the fire, and it was very hard. So then he ground it up and put it in some water, and it was delicious and invigorating, and he consumed this, and he lived off this for days. When they came back to get Omar's body, Omar was in great shape. So he took them back with this drink, and They made him a saint. A more famous explanation was of an Ethiopian goat herd named Kaldi, who observed his goats eating the coffee bean and then sort of prancing around with a great deal of energy. And so he thought, well, if the goats like it, maybe I can try it. He spent a lot of time with the goats, so he tried it, and he pranced around with a great deal of energy. And being a humble man of God, he took the bag of coffee beans to a monastery to give to the local monk, told him what this magic fruit had done, and the monk said, "This is obviously bad. This is unnatural. Nothing should work this way." And he threw it in the fire, and the delicious, enticing aroma of roasting coffee beans attracted the other monks, who pulled the beans out of the fire, put it in the water, and they all had coffee. And that was the beginning of coffee consumption. And this story is 700 years after the fact when it was first recorded, so it's probably not true. We think what happened was coffee was used by Sufi mystics as a stimulant to allow them to stay up day after day in a trance-like form. And it gradually spread from the Sufis to be consumed in the palaces of the pashas and governors of the local Muslim colonial states. And again, it had problems. It kept being declared, the word itself means wine and appetite suppressant. And so this problem of it being too stimulating made it seem to be somehow in contradiction to Islamic laws against wine consumption. It took a couple of fatwas by local governors to get coffee to be okayed for general use, and it actually became sort of identified as a Muslim drink very early on. Coffee, tea, and chocolate also actually come from Arabia. From the Middle East, it spread into Europe through trade and war routes. The first coffee bars opened up in Venice from traders. And then in Vienna, there was the siege, the Great Battle of Vienna, which was the turning point of the European and Islamic confrontations, which has lasted 1,000 years, ended. There was an encampment with a huge army from Persia that pulled out, in part because of the efforts of a man named Count Kolchitsky. Kolchitsky was a kind of a ne'er-do-well, but a polymath who spoke fluent Arabic because he'd been a trader in Istanbul, and he used to sneak past enemy lines singing Arabic songs with his valet, and he snuck away to the king, the local king and dukes, and they brought in reinforcements, and they won the battle. And he was given his choice of what he wanted as a reward, as the legend goes. They had all these bags of camel feed that they were going to throw into the river, but he knew they were coffee beans. And he asked only for the beans as his reward, and he opened up a coffee shop where coffee in Vienna is still drunk the Turkish way with a glass of water and some milk. England got its coffee shop soon thereafter. Paris, the original Parisian coffee shop, is still operating. The Dutch, instead of drinking coffee right away, began to plant coffee in their colonies. In Indonesia and Sri Lanka, specifically, there was an extensive coffee plantations, and they did not allow the laborers to drink the coffee that they harvested because they considered it too good for them. But remember how coffee is how coffee plants survive through the sort of propagation of their seeds. A local sort of rodent called the civet, which looks like a cat, a cross between a cat and a big rat, had a particular appetite for coffee beans, would select the juiciest coffee beans to eat. It was an omnivore, so it couldn't fully digest them, and it would poop them out. The beans would come out in their feces. And the laborers on these plantations were so interested in drinking this concoction that they were producing for their European overseers that they actually picked through the feces, pulled out the beans, cleaned them, and began drinking it. The Dutch saw this and immediately concluded this was too good for the laborers, and they began to collect the feces. So they forced them to give them the feces, and this Kopi Luwak, which is civet coffee, as you may know, has recently become a thing. It's like the best coffee. There was the most expensive coffee is this cat shit coffee. The idea is that the digestive process of the stomach that begins the sort of transformation of the bitter proteins into these sort of sweeter, mellower sugars that give a more mild coffee. Immediately, this is enough of an abuse story, but as soon as this became a valuable thing, people put the civets in cages so they could no longer roam wildly through the jungle finding the nicest, most sweet and succulent coffee plants, but they would force feed them sort of like they were veal, as much coffee as they could, and then they could collect the beans and clean them. And in fact, there's not much quality control, so nobody really knows when you're getting Kopi Luwak if you're getting authentic cat shit coffee or not. But in any case, people who try it say it's actually pretty bad, that it tastes like Folgers. A more reliable coffee animal hybrid is the monkey poop coffee, which actually, if the rhesus monkey eats coffee beans as well, but being a smart little monkey, it doesn't bother to eat the whole thing, just chews it and spits it out. So it's actually monkey spit coffee, and it keeps a sort of parchment-like cover on the bean, so it's called parchment coffee. And again, the idea is the amylase in the saliva begins the breakdown process for the bean. This whole concept was supersized recently for the most benevolent of reasons. I think it's called the Golden Triangle Elephant Sanctuary in Thailand. Reading about the popularity, but also the sort of moral questionability of cat shit coffee, began feeding their elephants a mash of fruit and coffee beans. The theory would be elephants need to eat a lot, and they're not very effective, they're not very efficient digesters. So when they would produce, and they're herbivores, so they're very good that they actually have a lot more of the acids that will break down the protein, and they're easier to locate the poop. So they have these immense, I think you need 30 pounds of beans to get 1 pound of coffee. It's called black ivory coffee if you're looking for it. And it is apparently quite lovely. It has a kind of floral, chocolatey flavor. It's sort of like as mild as tea. But that really wasn't the end of the resourcefulness of elephants. As sort of machines for this sanctuary. I also realized that in addition to being able to produce more coffee beans that had been semi-processed, elephant dung is mostly fiber. They eat a lot. They have to eat 400 pounds of foliage a day, and most of it comes out sooner or later. And the fiber that comes out is all plant work, and you clean that up, you throw in some Clorox, you can make a wonderful paper. And in fact, you can buy elephant poop paper, which I did, and I made elephant poop paper to bring here to draw, but I left it at home. You'll have to take my word for it. Next month I'll have some. It's basically, Tim wanted me to draw sort of R. Crumb vision of, this is R. Crumb by, is it Ernie Bushmiller, who did the Nancy comics, was famous for 3 stones. Like, the Platonic ideal of stones is the 3 stones, because 1 stone is just 1 stone, 2 stones is not enough, 4 stones. But then the R. Crumb smell lines, and then the flies. I was going to insist that people buy this because I'd invested so heavily in the elephant poop paper, but this is just regular, so you can have that. Somebody also realized that pandas are even more inefficient digesters than elephants, because they used to be carnivores until very recently, so they have to eat an awful lot of bamboo, and their poop is even more fibrous. So you can get really good panda paper too if you want. It's basically bamboo. But you have to really watch out because they're adulterated. It turns out they put in horse poop and cow poop and donkey poop at the same time. So if you have to insist. Even the elephant poop I got said elephant poop paper with recycled paper products. So I can't vouch for its clarity. At this point, I don't know if we're going to bring this madcap adventure to a screeching halt to have a coffee break. We made some coffee here. It has nothing to do with civets or pandas, but we have whiskey. Who wants to help with this? Because I shouldn't touch anything. You want to try?
It doesn't take 2 hours. You're going to keep drawing?
Well, I got to do something.
We could just say, maybe you could say do your own, or we could do that thing where you draw and you don't talk and I play, and then I get to play off.
Yes.
Okay, we'll do that. So green is decaf, this is regular milk, there's sugar. Yeah, pretty good.
Now, they're going to make their own, they're going to take their shots.
Give a shot of Jameson.
So we'll play during the coffee break. So we did a gig about a million years ago, 10 years ago, what was it? Vertex Lids. Yeah. And we did it more like a band, where Matt just drew like a maniac.
I'm going to introduce the next step in the
We can do whatever we want. Just kind of loosens things up.
I don't mind it long.
Yeah, I like this. You keep going.
Practicing elephants.
Somebody else is taking over that coffee stand.
How is it?
It's great.
Are you grabbing the decaf or the phone? I can't have it alcohol. All right, Tim.
All right, this is the
Bring it back. So, I'm going to tell how the U.S. Bank is So, random writing in books or pictures I stumble across send me off on these associations. Tim, with his finely trained ear, has a similar response to the kinds of stimulations from sound. He was describing an experience recently of sitting at his table in Ridgewood when a plane came flying over to or from LaGuardia, and the pitch of the engine was the exact pitch that you hear in the Beatles song Back in the USSR. And that sound set him off against his will, and the whole song came pouring out of his head. Even more strangely, but for our purposes, providentially, he was sitting at the table at another time during a period of rapid barometric change in the atmosphere. Yeah. And the drum kit, which he mysteriously keeps in his living room that Caroline indulges him in, began to pop and snap as the sort of pressure on the drum head changed. Correct? Is that right?
Old calf head, that's why.
And the rhythm of those pops perfectly aligned itself in his, I would say photographic, but I guess it would be your phonographic memory of a commercial from the 60s. Well, I don't know what else we can do because I got nothing else.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. It's
You
the.
never did it cleanly, so
Where?
try to do it cleanly now. Where you do that, and I pick it
You're gonna do it from there? You're not gonna come. Okay. It's the Maxwell House, one of the many Maxwell House commercials that plays on many of the sensory attractions of coffee that we've already gone over. Should we try it? Am I going to draw? I was going to do the whole Gary Marshall thing, but I'll just get even more stuff on my face.
3 seconds.
All right. It takes a minute, but Tim told me not to rush, so it might take a little longer. Okay, go. This is the sound of the coffee pot at work. Listen to it perk. Look at the coffee as it gets darker and stronger. Smell the honest coffee smell. Ah, smell it. But will this cup of coffee taste as good as it smells? You bet it will, because it's Maxwell House. The coffee that tastes as good as it smells every time. Maxwell House coffee tastes as good as it smells every time. If you like to look at good coffee, listen to good coffee, smell good coffee, and taste good coffee, brew Maxwell House. The coffee that tastes as good as it smells every time. Maxwell House is good to the last drop. It tastes as good as it smells every time. Maxwell House. Yeah. You bet. I should mention that the image of the coffee coming out of the last drop, which they use on their ad, also has an interesting history. Apparently, Maxwell House, whatever you think of it, was one of the first artisanal coffees. It was brewed up by these coffee savants in Nashville, and they gave it to the owner of the fanciest hotel in town, Maxwell House, and when they ran out of the free stuff, their patrons demanded more of it, and that began their association, and they used the name. And early in the history of the coffee, they were serving it at the Hermitage, which is the ancestral home of Andrew Jackson, the now discredited 8th president of the United States. But Teddy Roosevelt, who's still a popular president, apparently was visiting there one time, and he drank some of the Maxwell House, and he said, "Bully, this coffee is good to the last drop." And they said, "Somebody write that down," and it became their logo. Again, probably not true, but it's a good story. Jude and I were in Kentucky last week visiting her family. Both her parents are over 90. Her mother still drives the family tractor around the property every day. Her father still is a semi-active saxophone player. They're doing very well. Every morning they drink Folgers instant coffee, and then we run out to the nearest Starbucks because we're pathetic little yuppies. But I asked, in the spirit of the sort of research for this evening's talk, I asked Jude's father if any interesting random things had ever happened to him. And he said, well, as a matter of fact, when I was a young man, I was about 18, I was at Mississippi, and I was a freshman in college, and I was trying to avoid getting drafted into the war. It was about 1942. And he didn't know how he was going to do that. He wanted to be an officer, but he wasn't in any program to be an officer. But it was raining very hard. He was trying to cut across campus. And so to get out of the rain, he went into a building he'd never been in before. He was walking down the hall, and he saw a sign on the bulletin board that said something like Navy ROTC at University of Louisville. Learn to be an engineer. He thought, that's for me. I'll be an engineer. I'll be an officer. I'll get out of the draft in the infantry. So he did. He signed up. He went there. He didn't become an engineer, became enough of an engineer to stay in the Navy throughout the war. And he met Jude's mother. So probably we're all here because he went through that room, except for Tim. The theory is Tim would still be here. Play his drums, but
We'll try that too.
no, right?
Now you gotta see what it would be like if Matt wasn't here.
No.
The whole show would be this.
Yeah. Right.
For 1 hour.
Yeah.
But no drum.
Well, probably you would find somebody else to do the drum. But Kurt, you can do the drum. One of his friends in his band was a boy named Jimmy, who was a very talented clarinetist and trumpeter. And Jimmy wasn't as fortunate or resourceful or didn't have the rainy day experience that Jude's father did. And he was drafted into the Army. He was sent to boot camp and immediately sent to Europe and put into the meat grinder. Ended up in the Battle of the Bulge, was captured and spent the rest of the war in a German POW camp. After the war, where they all got together, Jude's father said, we were sitting on a hill. I remember looking out, it was a beautiful day, we're looking out across the valley in Kentucky, and Jimmy seems different. He was quieter, he was he'd been a very happy-go-lucky guy until then. He said, what happened? He said, no, nothing, but all day long in the POW camps, they played Wagner. Just Wagner all day long. It was very depressing, and somehow it sapped his soul. A week later, Jude's father went back to school, and Jimmy stayed with his parents. His parents went to church in the morning. When they came back, Jimmy had shot himself. And the story definitely still tugs at Jude's father. He always seems to wonder whether I don't think he was in any way going to end up like Jimmy, but he still wonders what would have happened if he hadn't gone into that house on that rainy day. We drove home from Kentucky. Usually we stay on the highway as long as we can. It's 740 miles, so it's at least 11 or 12 hours, and if you want to do it in one day, which we try to do, and you've got a couple of dogs, which we also have, you don't have many options. But we started early, and when we got about 40 miles out of town, Jude said, I'd like to stop at this state park I've been reading about in this book, The Sixth Extinction, by Elizabeth Colbert, that I've been reading about. It's a really interesting place. And it was just up the road, so we pulled in, and it's sure enough, it's an interesting place. There's a giant, it's a salt lick. I'm not sure, lick means river, but it also means a salt lick, and it's a kind of a swamp where a lot of prehistoric mammals met their deaths, and they don't have a lot of money for this park, so somebody volunteered their services and made a giant cement mastodon that looks sort of like a giant horse, and there's a sloth, and there's a bison, and they're all sort of sinking into the swamp. The story is that this salt, it was a kind of a salt lake that had sort of functioned sort of like the La Brea tar pits. These animals went in, they didn't come out, and their bones remained there. The local tribes knew about it. The salt was a source of sustenance, but there wasn't much use for these bones that were sticking out. Until 1739, a French war party came down from Quebec on the way to New Orleans, and this Count Languille camped nearby, and he sent some men out hunting, and they came back reporting this field. They were carrying an enormous tusk, a tooth, and a jawbone. And Languille, like many of his contemporary aristocrats, thought of himself as a bit of a polymath and a scientist, and so he had his men carry these objects with him throughout the rest of the disastrous campaign. Many of them were killed or deserted, but he kept these bones. At the end, he sent them back to Europe, where they sort of languished for about 50 years. At the end of the century, they began to be studied by a scientist there, an interesting man named Cuvier, who, contrary to a lot of the contemporaries, began to identify these bones as being belonging to a species that did not exist. And this was very important because the idea of extinction was a completely novel one. Everybody accepted the idea up until then that there were no weak links in creation, that any animal that ever was always would be. And they had their eyes to prove it to them. There was no evidence that any creature had ever lived before. But this was all beginning to change. One of the chief proponents of the sort of permanence of species, but also one of the most interested scientists of the time, was our man Thomas Jefferson, who was so interested in these bones that he kept sending different people out to collect more of them. They'd shown up first in a field in New York in 1705, these enormous bones of these elephants, which nobody had the name of. They were called the Pterodon, so the unknown creature. And the assumption was if they weren't here, they were somewhere out west, and that's one of the reasons that Jefferson sent Clark out there to find these bones, not to find the bones, to find the actual animal. And Jefferson had, this is not really a great Jefferson, but he had a lot of reasons, not just scientific, to wish to find these great beasts. He was especially enraged by a theory that was very popular amongst European aristocrats at the time, and most notably proponed by a guy named Count Buffon in Paris. And it was this was one of these public intellectuals writing like a 400 volume history of the world, and he was sort of fighting with Linnaeus, the Swedish pedant who was interested in categorizing things. And Buffon said, there's only 200 or 300 different animals to begin with. That we have to concentrate on the big questions because big thinkers think about big questions. And the big question that I'm interested in is, why is everything so much worse in the New World than it is in the Old World? He had a theory of American degeneracy, that all the animals, the bears were smaller in America, that the elk's antlers were smaller, the people were obviously stupider, and it was all because of the environment that was cold and damp. And nothing could grow there. Even Europeans, when they went there, became a defective form of themselves back home. And there was a lot of reasons behind this. I mean, he had no evidence for this. All his statistics were wrong, of course. It was all secondhand information. But it was important to hold on to because they had a vested interest in trying to discredit what was happening in the New World, this democratic revolution, the idea that the aristocrats, the people that they represented, were somehow not entitled to rule forever, was a challenge to their very essence. And so this theory was a way of negating or undermining the credibility of this new political movement. And of course, Jefferson had his own reasons to try to combat it. He tried to, he spent a lot of time. He got all the other founding fathers to measure all the bones on their plantations and send the information to him, and he compiled all these charts showing that the American bear was in fact 450 pounds and the European bear was 150 pounds and things like that. And he also sent speeches by a Shawnee chief there to show the level of intellect and moral advancement of the native peoples, which actually did begin to turn Buffon's mind around, but he never sort of gave in on the theory of extinction of the Jefferson thought they were mammoths, but they were mastodons. The bone, the tooth is a molar. That's why they're called mastodons. Jefferson sent an entire badly stuffed moose with the wrong antlers on to set it on his doorstep. He kept sending him stuff, trying to get him to convince him that things in the New World weren't as bad as he thought. Good old Ben Franklin had a much more timely and efficient way of proving this. He was at a dinner party where this discussion was going on about American degeneracy, and he asked all the Americans to stand up because he knew that they were all really big guys, and they all stood up. And then he told all the Frenchmen to stand up, and they were all really little guys. And he said, "You see?" And then he stood up himself. He said, "I myself am a small man," but the point had been made. Nice little. It sounds a little bit up the road from the big bone. So that's why we're wearing these ugly T-shirts, because we went into the gift shop and tried to find something with a big elephant on it, and this is the closest we could get. The Creation Museum, which is much better funded than the Big Bone Lake State Park, which calls itself, incidentally, the birthplace of extinction, which is a great title. Because that's where the theory of extinction sort of got its start. But the Creation Museum, of course, is at odds with all of this. That the Word of God is there on black and white, that the Earth is 6,000 years old, and the museum is really kind of fascinating because it's sort of an appeal. It presents itself as an appeal to rationality and open-mindedness, and that basically they see it as a fast versus slow theory of history, that everything that man says is that things took a long time, but the book says, God says it took a very short period of time. And how do we know? It's all there. We weren't there. We weren't around. It's the same idea. If we didn't see it, we can't prove it's not there. But they have beautiful animatronic dioramas of Cain killing Abel. They have the zip line above that you can ride on the zip line. I'm pretty sure it is. And they have a full-scale recreation of the Ark, which is 12 buses long, and it's complete with all the very elaborate explanations of how it would have been possible to get all the animals on the Ark for 40 days, and how Noah would have made the dry feed that would have fed them, and then, incredibly enough, a system of lattice work under the stalls where all the poop would go, and they would show how they could clean out all the poop over 40 days. In the diorama for the Ark, you see the animals going in 2 by 2, including dinosaurs. This is where they part ways with some creationists. There's no reason, and they're right, not to believe that the dinosaurs were there at the same time too, and they were in this sort of the pre-sin state of grace everybody was together. There's a wonderful animatronic diorama of a little girl playing in the field, and there's a kind of stegosaurus right behind her. Yeah, we should definitely. We didn't go there. We have to go there next time. We're not entirely sure we could hold it together for the entire time there, but I really would like to see some of this material. Before we left the Big Bone Lick gift shop, I noticed something on the shelf which caught my eye because it seemed so anomalous given the context. It was, we've talked a lot about founding fathers, so this may not seem so amazing, but it's this little red thing, and in peeking out of here, I don't have it folded in properly, was Abraham Lincoln's face. And here, it'd be like this. And it said, Lincoln Kennedy, coincidence? They had me right there. 18 remarkable coincidences in the two assassinations, reproduced on antique parchment that looks and feels old. That's part of it. And you probably have heard these, but they're too compelling not to go through. The idea is, as you know, that there are a lot of very strange coincidences that link the Lincoln assassination with the Kennedy assassination, up to the point that some people would say they're not coincidences at all. But anybody with any remote, rudimentary idea about statistics would realize they're not so. Well, anyway, let's go through these, just in case you need something to talk about. Both Lincoln and Kennedy were concerned with civil rights. Lincoln was elected president in 1860, Kennedy in 1960. Both were slain on a Friday and in the presence of their wives. Both were shot from behind and in the head. Their successors, both named Johnson, were Southern Democrats and were both in the Senate. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808, and Lyndon Johnson was born in 1908. John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839, and Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939. Actually, he was born in 1938. But Booth and Oswald were Southerners favoring unpopular ideas. Both presidents' wives lost children through death while in the White House. Lincoln's secretary, whose name was Kennedy, which is not true, advised him not to go to the theater. Kennedy's secretary, whose name was Lincoln, not true, advised him not to go to Dallas. John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and ran into a warehouse. Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and ran into a theater. The names Lincoln and Kennedy each contain 7 letters. The names Andrew Johnson, Lyndon Johnson each contain 13 letters. The names John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald each contain 15 letters. Both assassins were killed before being brought to trial. And finally, both Johnsons were opposed for re-election by men whose names start with G. People keep compiling these things even after this. I remember seeing a list like that when I was a kid, and now they're saying like both presidents had children who were appointed to high offices by subsequent presidents. Like Robert Kennedy was, I think, Secretary of the Treasury, and now Caroline Kennedy is the ambassador to Japan, which I don't know makes us part of this great chain of conspiracy. The most interesting one that they didn't touch here was that I read that a week before Lincoln was assassinated, he was in Monroe, Maryland, and a week before he was assassinated, Kennedy was in Maryland, Monroe. But I tried to do some research into this. I have no idea about what relationship he had with Maryland. Well, he was with Marilyn Monroe, and they were both in these. But the real problem with this story is not the Marilyn Monroe part. It's that there doesn't seem to be any place called Monroe, Maryland. I looked it up, and the only Monroe, Maryland I can find is a 128-year-old man living in Ruston, Louisiana, which is dubious enough on its own. I was so intrigued by this. I just bought this thing. I actually called gift shop a few days later and said, I was in your gift shop a few days ago, and I bought some shirts, and I bought this thing about the Kennedy-Lincoln assassination, the coincidences, and I'm just wondering, what is it doing in a paleontological gift shop? And there's a pause, and woman goes, well, I don't know. I think it's because it's a historical document. I said, really? She goes, yeah, it's a historical thing. And I kind of laughed until I looked more closely at this envelope, and sure enough, it says Historical Document Company. So it's quite true. On the wall of the synagogue that we live in is a sign, that beautifully made sign. Don't worry, we're getting to the end now. It says, admission to the High Holy Day service by ticket only. This is obviously done by it was made in the mid-60s by somebody who did this for a living. You see the sort of cursive only. Congregants without tickets will be assigned seats and given a ticket, which is to be paid for immediately after the holidays. It's a problem in many synagogues where people aren't regular attendees. They only come for the big days, and they have to entice them in. They have to make them pay. I remember as a young boy being brought in for these all-day sessions in which you don't know why you're there, and you're listening to lots of stuff that doesn't make sense, and you're sort of going a bit crazy. To keep us little boys happy, we would be told stories of Jewish heroism. The main one that we would hear was about Sandy Koufax. Sandy Koufax was a baseball player from Brooklyn, the only Jewish baseball player since Hank Greenberg who was any good. But in the mid-'60s, when he was at the top of his game, he was about as good as anybody. And his team, the Dodgers, were about as good as anybody. They were always in the World Series, it seemed. And the World Series is in the fall, just about when Yom Kippur, this sort of Day of Atonement, when you're supposed to, the holiest, most sacred day of the year, where you've got to atone for all your sins and hope that you're put in the book of life for the next year. Sandy, is the best pitcher on his team, is supposed to play in the first game of the World Series, and the first game of the World Series is on Yom Kippur. And he says, I will not play because I am a Jew, and I have to observe the rituals of my people. They say, see, if Sandy Koufax can do that, you can at least sit still for a few hours. And it had no impact on my religiosity, but I did like the amount of acclaim that Sandy got for this sacrifice. So I promised myself that when I was in the major leagues on Yom Kippur, I would not play in the World Series either, just so that mothers all over the country would be able to praise my sacrifice. There was the other Jewish hero that we were taught to admire because of his manliness was associated with the lesser in significance but more avidly followed holiday of Hanukkah. And this would be Judah Maccabee. Judah Maccabee was a sort of a freedom fighter / terrorist fighting the occupying forces of the Romans and the Greeks in the period before the Common Era. And the term zealot, and these were like the early zealots. There's some question whether they killed as many Jews as they killed the occupiers. They were quite uncompromising in their belief systems, but they were ferocious. Judah was the hammer of God, and unlike all the other depictions of Jews, except for he had a helmet and he had a sword and a shield with a Star of David on it, and he was a badass, sort of. The most famous story associated with the Maccabees was not Judah, but his younger brother Eleazar, who, in a battle with the Greeks, noticed the Greeks had war elephants, which were sort of like Panzer tanks of their time. They could carry the howdah on the top was actually a turret. They had archers up there they could shoot down. Their tusks were tipped with swords. There's only 9 of these elephant tusk swords left in the world. You can see one at the Met. Apparently a really well-trained battle elephant could take its tusks, throw a man in the air, and cut him in two on the way down, like a shrimp at Benihana. Anyway, Eleazar noticed a particularly well-outfitted elephant charging through the ranks, and he assumed that the king of the Greeks was on that. And so in a split second, he dashed under the elephant and stabbed it from below with his sword or spear, knowing that its death meant his death, but for the good of his people, he was willing to sacrifice everything. As it turned out, it wasn't the king's elephant, and they lost the war anyway. And there's some speculation that the story was told to sort of justify the defeat of the Maccabees in this battle, to show that they were heavily outgunned. And there's, in fact, a parallel history, a contemporary history of the battle that doesn't have Eleazar dying because the elephant fell on him at all, but that he actually drowned in a pile of elephant excrement. I promise that's the last time elephant poop comes up in the story, but it seems fitting. Yes, yes. Nice. Eleazar is more of a footnote now, but there was a period of time when he was a very important hero figure, not to the Greeks or the Jews, but to the early Christians. The theory of the early Christians were grappling with the problem of the Old and New Testament, both being the words of God, but both deviating on certain points, such as these laws about being kosher in one book but not in the other, or in the law of circumcision for the Jews. And one of the questions was, why would the word of God be depicted in one way in one book and not in another book, especially when the second book is obviously superior to the first book? And the theory of allegory came out of this, that anything that had to do with the sort of coming of Christ would obviously not be in the first book, but would be foretold in the second book. So it's a theory called typology, this theory of types because faces that were hammered into faces of coins, I guess, was where it came from. But the notion was that you would find, say, in the story of Jonah and the whale, a prefiguration of Christ, that Jonah went into the whale for 3 days and then came out. That was a form of death and then rebirth that prefigured Christ's own reanimation. And that Eleazar, in his sacrifice for his people, was again a forerunner of Jesus' sacrifice. And there's a book called The Speculum Humana. It's the mirror of human salvation, I believe. And there's the most amazing picture. It's sort of a conventional 13th century tapestry. So there's a kind of a man in male armor, and he's underneath with a spear. And there's this huron, there's soldiers up here. And then is the elephant, by somebody who's obviously never seen an elephant. It looks like Dr. Seuss somehow broke into the monastery and did it's a beautiful little skinny thing with this long sort of vacuum cleaner nose and little doggy ears. And there underneath is Eleazar stabbing it to death. A few years ago, I organized a show on utopia. And I had a lot of artists, many of them are in this room, who made pieces for this show about it's called No Place Like Utopia, and it's about the idea of perfect places. And there weren't just artists sort of from the art world, but people who were sort of interested in utopia from all over the place. One of the artists, the most interesting artists, was a guy named Gerald Jones, who was a kind of visionary artist. He had been taught as a young kid a lot of skills at the Pratt Institute, and then he had gone to Vietnam and sort of gone through the meat grinder there. He came back and spent the rest of his life trying to make work that sort of exalts us to be better than we are. It took him a while to find his way, he said, but he talked to an artist who told him that he had to learn to paint from within and not from without. And he began, and the man said, what animal do you admire? And he said, I admire the gazelle and the zebra. So he said, well, those are your spirit animals. You must let them lead you. And so he began painting these pictures they aren't quite vessels and they're not quite animals. They're these sort of interesting shapes of these things sort of swooping through space. heavily decorated with sort of elongated noses. Those are interesting enough, but the pieces that really struck me were his crucifixions, pictures of Christ on the cross. And they're pretty conventional, pretty familiar images. Christ is nailed to the cross on a hill, until you get to the head. The head is on a long neck like this, like it's stretching out like this, and then looking back under the left armpit, like this. Very strange. And I said, what's the story behind the way that you paint this scene all the time? He said, well, every picture of Christ on the cross you see, he's either looking up, or he's looking down, or he's looking to the right or the left. But if I was up there on a cross, I'd be trying to figure out what was behind me, sneaking up on me. And that's why I paint him like that, which I think is a very good answer. Thank you very much.